Baroness Mary Warnock graduated from Oxford University almost 60 years ago. Since then, she's held a number of distinguished posts, both in universities and in schools. She's chaired committees of national importance, like human fertilisation and environmental protection. She's best known, though, for the Warnock Report, which looked at the education of children who have special learning needs. Baroness Warnock, thank you for joining us today. I mean, clearly, by any measure, your own education seems to have been very successful. Oxford, quite early, and as a woman, that wasn't the normal thing to do in those years, and then into academia. So just tell us, what was your own schooling like? How do you look at it now, looking back after all these years?
Fantastic. I look at it as a kind of, well, a fantasy, because I was allowed to drop every subject except Latin and Greek and music. But looking back, I think my education was pretty freakish because it was so specialised.
And you, after graduating from Oxford, one of the things I find interesting about your career is you spent time as a Don, then as a head teacher, whereas the pattern normally is, you know, be in one and stay there or go into the other. And you dipped in and dipped out. Was that deliberate to sort of keep you in touch with teaching in different environments, or was it just the accident of a career?
I think it was just accident. I've always been a great one for saying yes if somebody asked me to do something. And after I'd been teaching philosophy at St Hugh's College, Oxford, for 15 years, I began to think, well, really, you know, I'd like a change. And somebody asked me whether I'd stand as headmistress of the Oxford High School. And I had been involved in schools all the time I'd been teaching, because in Oxford, the county then had always had someone from the university on their local education authority, and I'd been on that for a number of years. So I was deeply interested in schools.
Did you enjoy teaching in schools?
Oh, enormously.
It's very different than universities, though.
It's so much nicer. I absolutely loved it. It's a bit of my career I'd go back to.
But what is it that's better about schools than universities?
Well, partly, I think people at school, if they're well taught, are quite keen to talk to. I mean, they're not always trying to get away. They're not centrifugal at all. And so I had wonderful conversations with the people I taught, right from when they were 7 or 8 until they were 18.
You might have thought you'd have sort of stayed in academia, pushing the barriers of knowledge at Oxford or at some of the leading schools. And yet you spent a chunk of time doing the Warnock Report into children with special educational needs. Where did that interest come from? Do you know why you were invited to chair that committee? And what made you say yes? Had you already got an interest in that part of education?
I really hadn't got much of an interest, except I'd come across some of the problems. In the 60s too, Oxford was very experimenting very much in primary education and going in for child-centred learning and all kinds of things, which horrified me a bit, I have to say. But I was becoming interested in that. And the person who asked me was Mrs. Thatcher, in fact. Right. She was then Education Secretary. But then the Conservative government fell almost immediately after, in 74. And the Labour Party took it on. And
the report was published in 78. So you must have been sitting as a committee for quite some time.
It was 4 years. We were given 4 years to do it. And the first part was easy. We were just collecting facts.
Yeah. But that's what's interesting, because I think that people now forget what education was like for children with learning difficulties prior to the Warnock Report. I mean, when you began to collect those facts, what did you find? How was our education system dealing with these children with learning needs?
Well, there was one very important Education Act in 1972, and it was because of that, I think, that the committee was set up. And that brought all children, whatever their disabilities, under the Department of Education, as it then was. Up to 72, there had been some children who were so severely disabled that they were deemed to be ineducable, and they fell under the Department of Health or something. But that Education Act seemed to me to be absolutely groundbreaking. And I think schools and educational authorities found themselves at great loss. They didn't know how to deal with these extremely severely disabled children in an educational setting. So I think part of our task then was to explain a concept of education that would encompass all children, even if they couldn't sit up, couldn't speak, couldn't feed themselves. Still, education meant an enormous amount to them. It meant a huge difference.
And it was a huge cultural change and really, I suppose, raising expectations of them and making the education system realise that.
Nobody was allowed simply to vegetate with
That's right.
nothing being done. Children, as far as possible, who had special educational needs, were to be educated with other children. They were no longer a race apart. And we did try very hard to get away from the sort of medical model in which one was concentrating on what was wrong with a child, and thinking in terms of how far they could get along the sort of common educational road. I always had a vision in my mind of that Startrite advertisement with two children trudging along a road that disappears far into the future. And this is how I thought of education. So it was a road that was common to everybody.
How did you imagine it would turn out when you talked about educated children, presumably in schools together?
Well, we certainly never envisaged that the special schools should be abolished. And there was a particular category of children who were then known as maladjusted and are now emotionally and behaviourally challenged, whatever they are, for whom we thought there would have always to be special schools, because our whole difficulty was not fitting in to the ordinary school environment. But then we also thought that probably special schools would remain for children who had very severe and complicated and multiple disabilities, including mental disabilities, but probably others as well.
Presumably what you were trying to say was that there needs to be more inclusion than there is, but it shouldn't be 100%.
Absolutely, that was exactly what we were trying to say. But there was, even on our committee, a fairly radical left, if I can put it like that, who thought that now that the comprehensive ideal had been introduced, that ideal would never be fulfilled unless all children went to the same school, whatever their disabilities.
And that argument is still mirrored today, isn't it, in the debate that we're having about SEN?
And I don't think that argument has changed, but it was never convincing, I think. And if in the report we did put in a lot of cautionary words about not carrying inclusion too far. And we also envisaged various different patterns of integration.
Yes.
But I think the good thing about that was, and still is, people could talk openly about their children's particularly mental disabilities, and it became accepted that you didn't hide away your children, or it wasn't a disgrace that they had a mental disability. And I think that did change, partly, as I said, because of the Act of Parliament of 1972, but partly because of our report.
And the other issue, you said in recent months that you've had second thoughts on was that what we call the statement in process, that there should be some children with statements and others not. I mean, I think I've read that you said it's turned into a bit of a bureaucratic nightmare, and I would agree with you wholeheartedly. But if you talk to parents, they see that as the gold standard. It's the only thing that guarantees them the resources they feel their child needs.
Well, that, of course...
presumably that's why you went for statements, because it would carry a resource with it.
Yes, we wanted statements because it placed a mandatory duty on local authorities to provide what was in the statement. But that was an incredibly naive idea and took no account of shortage of resources.
Yes.
And of course, when in 1978, the real Thatcher cuts hadn't started really. They started in 1981, which was the year of the Education Act that followed our report. But we really hadn't grasped how important it was going to be that local authorities would be strapped for money.
It almost becomes a battle to get a statement to get the resource.
Yes, but the trouble is that the statement is pretty well valueless now because of shortage of money.
How do you think it could be coped with? Because there's no doubt that educated children with special needs is obviously more expensive, and there'll always be this dilemma of how much money have we got and how do we spend it. If you were to take the statements away and not have that, if you like, that legal protection, I mean, what judgment have you made about whether those children with great needs would be better served?
it is a real problem, but I think, rather reluctantly, I think, that treatment of children with special needs ought to be centralised in the sense that there ought to be ring-fenced money that simply may not be spent on anything else.
What you're suggesting almost is like a ring fencing to special needs rather than a ring fencing to each child that comes to the state.
Ring fencing for special needs, and then it could be left to the local authority or the schools to utilise all the possible ways there are of educating children with special needs, including schools grouping together, making use of special schools and their expertise and so on. And an imaginative authority could do far better if they had that money that had to be spent on that and nothing else.
You talk about patterns of provision. I think that's probably one of the most interesting parts of the present SEN debate. And you've talked about centres of excellence. And I'm not sure whether you imagine special schools being centres of excellence or whether we have units attached to mainstream schools as centres of excellence.
I think centres of excellence is an extremely useful idea. There's very little evidence about which kind of pattern works best. But there is some evidence that the Eleanor Rathbone Foundation has just produced that at any rate for children with moderate learning difficulties, units within the school work least well because they tend to get sidelined by the ambitions and plans of the main school. So my own feeling is that we ought to build up special schools which would then sort of radiate out. I know this is an idea that the Labour government has certainly had. They could radiate out their expertise. But I don't think one should regard them as good only for that. Because one of the things I've come to the conclusion is that a lot of children with special needs find it very difficult to learn anything in a large school. It's simply the press of other children, and this is particularly true of children with Asperger's or somewhere on the autistic.
So it's not just being in a small class, it's being in a small class in a small school.
Absolutely right. A small class, of course, is something, but for those children, they pretty well have to have one-to-one teaching anyway, whether in a classroom or not. But it's more, particularly this is true of secondary schools, it's more rushing from one classroom to another.
The corridors.
The absolute chaos that there is in any large school, in the playground and the corridors and everywhere. And children with Asperger's simply cannot cope with that. They simply go to ground and they begin to refuse to go to school at all, or they get sick. And so I think one of the huge merits of special schools is that they can be small in size, and of course then the staff ratio is extremely favourable, and best of all, everybody in the school knows everybody else, so it's like a family really.
No security.
And so I think that anything that somehow set about abolishing that kind of learning environment for children would be a disaster.